Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 25, I think, or thereabouts. I don't know. I've never really thought about this podcast in episodic terms, so it's always kind of felt funny for me to put the episode number on it. It's always felt more like a collection of all the different no-till systems than perhaps a series of them. This podcast to me is somewhat of a catalog in that way, and I'm super excited to add into that catalog Hana and Daniel Fulmer of Tierra Vida Farm out there in Durango, Colorado. This is a profitable and productive no-till farm that I have been hearing a lot about recently, so getting the chance to chat with them about their no-till system was great. We talk about soil prep and bed management, how they use goats and cover crops together, which is really interesting. We talk about water and irrigation out there in the West, which is always an interesting kind of complex subject. But we also talk about an injury that Daniel suffered and how they managed that as a farm, which I thought was really insightful. Also kind of terrifying. As always, if you appreciate this work and it's adding some amount of value to what you do, consider kicking in a few bucks over at patreon.com/farmerjesse. We are inching ever closer to that $1,000 a month challenge. That money is essentially just to help me pay some folks to help me produce this podcast for a second season. As a full-time farmer, that's just going to be a massive relief on me. So any money that you can donate, that would be great. We are going to start announcing some events over there soon. We'll have some bonus content shortly. If you're interested, you can check us out, patreon.com/farmerjesse. That's Patreon. You can also kick us a donation over at Venmo to @NoTillGrowers. Venmo's like an app. It's great. They should pay me for how much advertising I do for them anyway. But I know they also don't make money. PayPal makes money, but they don't make money. Anyway, that's irrelevant. Thank you all. Those donations will keep this thing going for a second season. You're awesome. Also awesome, our sponsors. Today's show is brought to you by Growing for Market magazine. For 28 years, Growing for Market has been the source for direct food and flower growers. All GFM content is custom written by farmers, many of them no-till farmers, and others who get their hands dirty and know what they're doing. Growing for Market does not recycle content that you have seen elsewhere. If you do farmers market, CSA, farm stand, pick your own, florist sales, or wholesaling, your business is just different from any other kind of business. Whether you're a commercial grower or just want to grow like one, subscribe to GFM for the nitty-gritty of growing, marketing, and the business of small farming 10 times a year. Available as a paper magazine, digital download, or both. Subscribe to GFM for the latest on market farming. There's information on growing vegetables and flowers in every magazine. And I will add, lots of good no-till articles. They were way ahead of the game on this one. Use the coupon code NOTILL, lowercase, all one word, to get 20% off any subscription through growingformarket.com or call 800-307-8949. Subscribers always get 20% off the carefully curated selection of books that GFM carries, including GFM editor and podcast guest Andrew Mefford's new book, The Organic No-Till Farming Revolution, where Mefford interviews 17 different growers using no-till and gives an overview of the techniques, providing a roadmap for anyone interested in starting a no-till farm or converting an existing one to no or less tillage. That's growingformarket.com. All right, enough for me. Let's get to our excellent interview with Hana and Daniel Fulmer of Tierra Vida Farm. Hana and Daniel Fulmer, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Very excited to have you both on. You came highly recommended by some of our guests, and I thought it'd be cool to just start with the basics, have you introduce us a little bit to Tierra Vida and, tell us a little bit about where you are, how much land is under cultivation, and those sorts of things.
So we're located in Durango, Colorado, which is in the southwestern corner of Colorado, and we're located at 6,500 feet, and then right on the river bottom. And what that means to us is that we have a really short growing season. We regularly, even during warm drought years, get a late frost. Last year it was June 13th, and then we get another frost usually around the end of September, but then we can have a long, dry, relatively warm fall. But nonetheless, it's a pretty short June 15th to September 15th frost-free window. But the nights stay cool as a result of the river bottom as well as the high mountain air at 6,500 feet. So that really affects what and how we grow to some degree. But when we started the farm, I was actually, before we started farming 5 years ago, I was doing work for National Young Farmers Coalition, doing a research project on drought resilience, and that provided me with the opportunity to look at a variety of farms, both ranches and small farms. I actually went to Singing Frogs Farms with Paul and Elizabeth Kaiser, and I saw their operation. It was at that point that I actually saw a farming model that I wanted to emulate. And with the other producers I've been talking to, they were all talking about soil health, but theirs was the model for which I saw something I wanted to actually try and recreate here in Durango. So that was the genesis of how we started farming, was seeing theirs with the high compost no-till method. And it's been 4 years of adapting their model to our situation of a shorter season, higher altitude, and not having municipal compost available.
Yes, so I would add to that so we're going into our fifth season, and we would definitely kind of put ourselves into the regenerative category, in that we are no-till, but we're also doing cover crops, and we utilize compost, and we don't have any synthetic inputs, and we try to utilize animals in our operation as much as possible. So we are a diversified vegetable farm. We are about a 60-40 split between CSA and wholesale. That keeps changing a little bit every year as our CSA grows. So going into our fifth season, we'll be doing 125 CSAs during our 18-week summer CSA, and then we do a 10-week fall CSA as well that runs from October up until Christmas, and for that one we do 50 members. And that's been steadily growing over the years. So last year we were at 90 members. The year before that it was at 50. And then the first year that we officially had a CSA, it was at 25. The first year of growing, we did a little bit of CSA, but it was mainly like friends and family. It wasn't really official. And then our wholesale is some grocery stores. We sell to a local hospital, several restaurants, and then 2 of our schools in the farm to school program. And in terms of acreage, we have 3 acres inside of a deer fence. We have yet to grow cash crops on all 3 of those acres in any given season. So last year we were at about just around 2 acres in cash crops for the 2018 season. This year we'll probably up that a little bit more.
That's great. So what were you doing, Hana, before getting into farming?
Yeah, so I, shortly after Daniel and I met, which was about 8 years ago now, I transitioned into health and nutrition, really stemmed from my own personal health crisis. And so I had been doing various things. I started off as a health coach, which with kind of basic dietary and lifestyle modifications. And then over several years, I ended up going in much more of a targeted functional medicine nutrition standpoint, looking at really like specific diets and lifestyle management for chronic illness. And so that's what I was doing. I was running my own business. And then, it was about, last season I was definitely full-time on the farm. The season before that, I really started in, and that was for a couple of reasons. Personally, I really like being outside and having my hands in the soil. And also I felt like it was the high leverage point. I was spending a lot of time trying to get people to change their dietary habits, but often there wasn't enough access to the really high quality foods, so that people were just going to the grocery store and buying organic. But what I really want to see is consumers become highly educated about regenerative grown food, and part of that is more of us growing that way. So, and then Daniel also had a knee blowout and had to get knee surgery, so that kind of pushed me in that direction as well.
Oh, that's great. Can you tell us a little bit about that story? I've always been very afraid of a sort of season-ending injury like that. What was the story with that, and how did that work out?
Oh, that was a challenging start to a year. I'd been having knee problems. I'd had Lyme's disease for quite a while, chronically, I think, is where that really started. But anyway, I had one knee surgery about 6 years ago before we started the farm. And then I injured the other knee, meniscus is what it was, while rock climbing. And I was managing it, thinking it was fine and avoiding the idea of getting surgery a second time until I was building our fourth greenhouse, a 26 by 30 Gothic, and tripped over something, and it dislocated again. The meniscus dislocated from where it's supposed to be, and that was on April 1st, I believe. So as any farmer knows, vegetable farmer knows, it's just when the rush of wind from the farm speeding up is really getting loud in everybody's ears. It's just really getting busy. And so I talked to the surgeon, and he said, like, oh, it could be easy, could be, just a quick orthoscopic process where I'm back on my feet in a couple days, or it could be a full-blown repair, sewing the meniscus together and on crutches for 2 months. And I didn't know until I woke up from surgery that it was the latter, that I was going to be on crutches for 2 months. So all of April and all of May, which is what happened. And of course, once I was off crutches, I could still barely move. So I wasn't really functional on the farm until the end of, mid-July, really. So we managed, but yeah, Hana certainly took on more than her fair share of the operation during those 3 months. And we had some long conversations about what we were going to do. And we had, my brother at the time was there, and he really stepped up to the plate and did some additional work, but also Hana really took the bulk of the responsibilities on.
We also had, we did a big transplanting day where we called on some friends and neighbors that came in and helped us with some stuff. And then, to Daniel's credit, he spent days and days sitting down, scooching backwards with his crutch hanging off of his one leg as he would go down a bed and transplant or weed or whatever he was doing. So he was still out there, but yeah, it was definitely a challenging season.
Yeah, I wasn't about to stay home and sit on the couch, so I would drag myself backward through each of the aisles weeding and transplanting. I'd have people set out transplant flats, and I would just intersect them and then go up and down row after row. We had 100-foot rows at the time, and we do everything through transplants anyway, or largely everything. And so I could stay outside and offset labor on the farm, but I just spent all day on my butt.
Wow, I will add really quick, okay, from a business management standpoint, we've been able to start up our farm on a relatively small loan, and then develop everything there on a cash basis. And so in that season, we were able to keep all of our CSA members happy. We did, dial down a little bit on wholesale in a couple of places. And because we didn't have these huge loans that we were having to do monthly payments on, right, we could kind of tweak that a little bit. So that year we weren't able to be quite as profitable as we had hoped, but we were able to make it all work and keep customers happy, and not, default on anything or get behind on payments, which was really nice.
Yeah, that's interesting. It made me wonder, did you learn any business lessons in terms of, being more prepared for that in the future? Is there anything that you've changed or anything that you would change?
It's an interesting question. I mean, we were small enough at that point. So this was 2 years ago, the summer we're talking about, where I had knee surgery. And the farm at that point was 3/4 of an acre in continuous production for the year. And a couple things just to back up a little bit I didn't describe earlier. Basically, when I constructed the farm, it was all built on 1/4 acre blocks. So every block is 100 by 100, and they have 35 beds that are 100 feet long in them. And they're all raised beds. And then, like I mentioned before, it's almost all transplants. And then we direct seed lettuce mix and carrots, about the only things, and radishes that we direct seed. But so that year when I injured myself, we were still fairly small, just over an acre of production. And with the three of us working it, we were able to keep ahead of it. Like Hana said, we were able to manage profits, but just barely. Since then, as we've grown, because of that experience, but then also generally the maturity of the farm has moved more and more towards increased efficiency. I think of it as operational efficiency. How quickly, how efficiently can we like spread compost, or can we transplant beds and that sort of thing. But then also we're working on putting together an employee manual and SOPs for various tasks inside the pack shed and that sort of thing. And it doesn't necessarily, those procedures don't necessarily remove us, Hana and I, from being responsible managers for all the complex operations, but it helps us to explain what we're doing to someone in a shorter amount of time before they're actually effective. And so managerially, we're a little more effective than we have been then as a result.
That's a great answer. Definitely having the standard operating procedures laid out for somebody to be able to come in and just say, look at that card and go for it. Can you describe a little bit how you set up those those SOPs?
Yeah, so last year we wrote an employee manual as well as a food safety plan. And in the beginning of the season, we go through and we do like a half-day training with everyone where we go through some of the real basics, like, you got to wear like closed-toed shoes and, appropriate clothing and no glass bottles inside the pack shed and, some of that sort of stuff. We go through like appropriate hand washing technique and things like that. And then in the beginning of the season, we've noticed that it's really important that we're out there with everybody for the first month or two, maybe not two, but month of the season, to really like set the pace and the quality of what we're doing. And through that, so a lot of that training is very hands-on training, backed up by that manual that kind of goes through some of like the basic steps of that. And this year, we're hoping to take that up a notch by having some of those like, laminated SOPs, whether they're pictures or just, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the pack shed, to have that be more visual for people. But that's kind of how we did it last year.
That's great. I'd like to talk a little bit about your bed prep and get a kind of general idea. But maybe we could go back to when you were setting up those first quarter-acre plots, and you could tell us how you would or how you did break the ground to get those ready, or how you would do it.
Right. Yeah. Well, because there's two answers there. There's how I did it initially and how I do it now in retrospect, of course. But I think it's fair to assume that we operators are all operating with a certain amount of a degraded resource, and so we're all responsible to building and improving the soil as we start and continue to operate the farms. And for us specifically, I mentioned we're right next to the river, and I think historically about 100 years ago, the river was a little bit closer to the farm, and so we were in kind of an eddy where a lot of clay was deposited. So most of the 3 acres that we farm on has got extraordinarily heavy clay. We've joked more than once about how we make more money selling adobe bricks than we would carrots, but nonetheless, we started a farm here instead. But what I did initially, it was all in pasture and had been for the last 100 years, and so pretty compact, and had about a 2-inch layer of sod over the top that was functioning. It was growing well, but when I dug into it, that sod layer was only 2 inches deep, and beneath that was this compact clay layer of clay that smelled like formaldehyde and was very gray, obviously very anaerobic. And I initially hired a friend or actually just he offered. I was going for the free route. He had a 50 horsepower tractor and like a 12-foot disc, and he offered to go do it. And he almost made sparks going over the field. He's like, it was just way too hard for him to work with. So I ended up hiring another neighbor at $100 an hour to come out, and he spent a day going over it. He had a 100 horsepower tractor with a hydraulic 3-point hitch, and he went over it with a rotary harrow and disked it disc, rotary harrow, and then a subsoiler. And at the end of that day, there was just big clumps of sod everywhere, but it was far from vegetable material. So then I rented a tiller and I tilled the whole thing up. And after that initial workup, I let the sod dry because all of the grasses that we have out here are rhizomatous. And so if I just went into watering it right away, that grass would reattach and begin to grow again. So particularly out here in Colorado, I could actually let it dry and that would kill the sod. And then we started planting, and this was all in the course of like 3 months. We had the land available to us starting in late February. It ended up being a little bit of a dry spring, so we'd get on early. And by the 1st of May, I was planting lettuce transplants. But most of those transplants were in sod. What we did is we ended up raking by hand the first quarter acre into raised beds, and which basically amounted to piling the sod up into a air quotes raised beds so that we had some semblance of soil depth. And we did that on the quarter acre, and then the rest of the acreage we just planted in cover crop and managed with goats grazing. But that was how we did do it. And if I were to do it again, I think I would plant cover crop with like a seed drill or something directly into the sod, go work construction for a couple of years. I worked construction previously, make a reasonable profit doing a trade, and graze the cover crop, grow it, and like build that soil without all the mechanical intervention. Not because it was bad necessarily, it just wasn't effective if I were to give biology more time of a couple of years to actually work that soil up. And so when I did the first two, like I described previously, and the last acre I actually did this way, where I tilled lightly, planted cover crop, and then grazed it for a full year, with like 60 days of growth in between grazings. And that cover crop was a mix of sorghum Sudan and rye and bursting clover, and vetch and peas and oats. And the goats just grazed that. And in that 1 acre that I did more recently, we were able to use that last year for the first time, and it took a total of 2 growing seasons to get it into shape rather than the 3 and 4 that it took the other ones to get to the same place. But that was how the initial prep and workup actually looked. Yeah.
So then did you get the cover crop? Like, I'm trying to picture how you got the cover crop into that sod. Were you just broadcasting it and then watering it? How exactly did that work?
So yeah, the second time the second acre that I did with a little more experience, I went through and I rented a what's called a hay renovator. It's got 3 coulter discs. They're like 16-inch discs, and then subsoilers that are drug behind it. And I pulled those through the soil, and they got down about 6 inches deep. And I went across that in a couple different directions, making basically diamond shapes with the subsoiler, and that gave me just enough opening in the sod to actually be able to till it afterwards, and that set back the sod enough that I could actually broadcast the seed, and then I just made a drag out of a piece of fencing and drug it after that. And I, of course, timed all this, intending for it to be just before it rained, and then it rained, and then I put more water on it. Eventually, I got the cover crop to come up. But the sorghum Sudan, in particular, was my favorite for some of that initial management because it does such a good job of tillering. I had grown tillage radish, but the clay was so hard that once it hit the clay pan, the tillage radish would just grow upwards, and the tuber would just be this 4 or 5 inch long stubby tuber on top of the ground rather than breaking up the soil. So anyway, sorghum Sudan did a much better job for us of actually breaking up that clay layer, so that when I came back through and grazed it, and then in the springtime tilled it, all that root mass had broken up the soil enough to where the tiller could go down to full depth, incorporate some of that residue. And then after that tillage of incorporating the cover crop residue, I then shaped the beds. I made a little tool on a toolbar that had some shovels that would push the dirt into piles and open up the aisles where the tire tracks were, and made us about 6-inch tall, 30-inch wide beds.
Okay, and then what's the next step in that process?
Well, once we built the beds, and once I actually figured out to use a tractor rather than a hand rake to build the beds, we use a lot of silage tarps, and so I would, once they were tilled, water it really heavily. And now I'm going to I guess, begin to describe a little bit more of what we currently do, because this is getting close enough to being similar, that what we currently do is, once that initial tillage to shape the bed and all the soil disturbance that happened to get the bed ready for planting, the first time, I then put drip on it or watered it heavily to make sure there's plenty of moisture to germinate the weed seeds. Put all that moisture down and then covered it, and we cover with 30 by 100 foot black tarps, and we leave it there for 2 weeks, and that was enough. And that plastic is enough to hold the moisture in and the warmth along with it to get all the weeds to germinate. We had our primary annual weed problem was pigweed, and after a week, I could pull up the tarp and just the pigweed carpet of just this. It was a continuous purple carpet of pigweed, and I'd leave the tarp leave it down for another week, and it would kill those pigweeds. And then the seed bank in the top inch or so was sufficiently germinated and killed. So then I'd pull the tarp back off the beds, and we'd transplant directly into those beds from there. Now that we have more compost, which we can talk about in a minute, but now we put down an inch of compost just before each rotation, so that after the tarp is pulled back, I then lay down a layer of compost over each of the beds. Because we don't till at all after those initial bed prepping stages, it's still not beautiful tilth like you'd experience behind a tiller, and we use a paper pot transplanters, and then as well a jang for seeding. And so the clumpy residue that's just normal in a no-till scenario is too challenging for those two tools. And so having the addition of 1 inch of compost provides an immediate level of tilth, as well as its long-term benefits of fertility and biological improvement. So we put that compost down, and then we come through with either the paper pot transplanter or the jang and do our seeding at that point.
Yeah, I want to add just one thing in there in terms of the black plastic. We get really intense spring winds here, and so it can be pretty challenging to keep those really big pieces of plastic down. And so we're starting to lessen the amount of time that we have to have those in place. Daniel built a flame weeder last year, and so we're starting to incorporate that in as well, so that we can use the black plastic to germinate some of those weed seeds a little bit, and then pull the plastic off and use the flame weeder before transplanting. And so I want to throw that out there, if there's anyone who's listening who's like, we're way too windy for black plastic or for big pieces of plastic, we totally get it. And that's another way to do some of the weed management in that regard.
Yeah, thank you. That's an important point, because the plastic had been on 2 to 3 weeks, and then just last year, when I built this bed top flame weeder, it's a 30-inch wide flame weeder. It has allowed us to remove the plastic in as little as a week. If out here, if the soil was wet enough initially to cause the weeds to germinate, then I can pull it back and actually flame weed it. And so we've reduced our black plastic use by 1/3 to 2/3, which is helpful both because of how much more ground we have to cover. We're up to 2 acres now, as well as just the amount of time is less, and in the wind, that's everything.
It's so funny because what made me 5 minutes late to this interview was fixing the black plastic tarps that just got blown off by the crazy wind we've been having.
Yeah.
What are you all using to secure those in general? No, it's been a developing idea, I guess, as is a lot of this stuff. Initially, we were using sandbags. We're still using sandbags. I bought some UV resistant sandbags from, I don't know,
what the website was, some like USA, whatever. Anyway, but I found that we also have a 30-foot long aluminum 3-inch irrigation pipe, which we don't use anymore for irrigation, but I had a bunch of it sitting on the fence. And so I started to roll those 30-foot lengths of irrigation pipe onto the edge, particularly the windward edge, so that the first 2 feet folded over itself. And then I'd put sandbags every once in a while down that length, but I'd have to use far fewer sandbags, and that pipe wasn't enough to weigh down the tarp, but the combination of the two allowed wind or prevented wind from getting underneath it. Having the pipe there kept wind from getting underneath the tarp, and the sandbag just kept the tarp in place around the pipe. And that's been really helpful because otherwise, you just can't put enough sandbags down in the springtime. I'd put them down every 5 minutes or every 5 feet, and the wind would still get underneath it and start to pull it up over time.
Yeah, it can be such a challenge, and we do something similar with using our stakes, like our T-posts. In the off season, we'll have those on the tarp and then have rocks on top of that. So trying to prevent the wind from coming underneath. So what about water and irrigation? And I know I've spoken with somebody else that was in Colorado, and just generally in the West, it can be an issue. So what is your all situation with water, and then how are you irrigating?
You want to start that one, Daniel?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's another technical thing. I mean, our situation with water, I mean, yes, we're in Colorado where water, they say it's for fighting, not for drinking. And we have water rights that are particular to our region, but which ultimately means that for our situation, we can have, like last year, it was extreme drought conditions. We only had 14 days of irrigation water, not enough to grow vegetables on. More typically, we'll have water irrigation coming from the ditch until late August. But the situation we have at our land is that we have a quarter-acre pond that has historical water rights to it. So that means we can actually store that water and then pump from there to run the farm. And in a typical year, between the flow of the irrigation ditch to fill the pond and it going long enough during the season that we can actually finish the season with what's left in the pond, it's typically very easy. Like, it's not a concern for us. Last year, in an extremely dry year, we could tell by February that it was going to be an extreme drought year. So we committed to putting drip on every single one of the beds on all 3 acres. So now we run and it's drip that we leave on the beds at this point, but we have 2 lines of drip that are 9-inch on center emitters going down each of the beds, and we have low flow emitters on there. I don't remember what the gallons per minute is, but it's a low flow emitter, and it's the 15 mil drip tape so that we can use it for multiple years and hopefully not create too much of a pile of plastic when we're done. And we pump uphill from the pond through a 2-inch main line that we've buried. And at the pump, it's a 2 horsepower pump that we use to run all three acres worth of drip. We have a pre-filter, and then at each of the manifolds, I built a riser that has controller valves that are run through a regular Rainbird professional grade sprinkler controller. And so we have control over which zones run and how long they run, and we can set a program and walk away from it to some degree, at least for the day, and not have to worry about things. But then all those manifolds have a separate filter that filters just before each of the drip, so that things are well filtered, and it allows us to walk away, like I say.
Yeah, I'll add to that, so we just got back from Denver, where we were doing some policy work with Rocky Mountain Farmers Union and National Young Farmers Coalition, and water in the West is like the big topic of conversation, particularly on the heels of the drought year that we had last year. And, like Daniel was saying, we're we're lucky in that the property that we lease on has both water rights and then storage rights, which are different in Colorado, and not many people have those storage rights where they can have a pond. And that being said, our pond is not very big. And so last year, we really saw the benefit of the improvement in soil health. We tried to really measure it last year, and we came up with, we used right around 0.75 acre feet or 9 inches, which in our area, anywhere from 3 to 5 acre feet for row crops is pretty standard. And so we were able to really use a lot less water, which allows us to effectively use that small amount that we can store, irrespective of how many days the actual irrigation ditch is running, which can vary widely from season to season, just depending on the level in the reservoir that we pull off of.
You mentioned earlier about that you don't do a lot of seeding, that you do majority of transplants. Can you talk a little bit about that? Where that kind of decision came from, and how you manage it?
Yeah, I can start on that. So, like Daniel mentioned earlier, we don't come from farming backgrounds at all. I grew up in the Midwest in Wisconsin and always had a garden, and Daniel had done some gardening as well, but we definitely don't come from an agricultural background. And we had done one summer where we were interning / working on a organic farm in our region that's pretty conventional in terms of how they grow things, and there were a lot of weeds, and it was really tough working conditions there. And when Daniel went on to work for National Young Farmers Coalition, he was kind of playing with this idea of farming. And it was when he came back from Paul and Elizabeth Kaiser's out in California that a light bulb had kind of gone off. And so we sort of consider them some of our mentors, and our model is loosely based on theirs, adapted to our region. But part of that is transplanting. And so we went in knowing that we wanted to transplant so that, we had things going into the soil that were already 2 to 3 inches tall, and therefore were ahead of any weeds and could crowd out weeds, so that we could be putting strong plants in and have better yields because of that. We could plant more densely. We could intercrop things. There was a lot going into that, not to mention the not tilling, and therefore not having to have that perfect seed bed to transplant into. As Daniel mentioned, now that we're using a paper pot transplanter, we're kind of having to get somewhere in between there. Things can't be quite as clumpy as they could be if we were hand transplanting everything. But yeah, we start everything, virtually everything from seed, and Daniel can speak more to this, but the paper pot transplanter has allowed us to take even some of the things that we were direct seeding, like high curry turnips and beets, and we are now doing those in paper pots. And so we start all of that stuff, in March and April. We have things that will start inside under grow lights and then move out into a greenhouse. Other things will start out in the greenhouse in flats. But yeah, I'd say 99% of what we're planting is all going in from transplant.
Yeah, I would just add a couple more things to that. In regards to transplanting, the first benefit to us as farmers was the opportunity to stay ahead of weeds, and it completely shifted our ability to manage weeds to something that we weren't managing for once they occurred, through various ways of weeding. But instead, we were pre-managing before we even transplanted stuff. So at the same time we were starting our transplants of seeds in a flat, was at the same time we were putting our tarps on the ground and beginning to germinate the weed seeds. And so the space outside in the garden was no longer producing the last crop; it was involved in the next crop. It's just that we just pre-germinated the weeds at the same time we were getting our transplants ready. And then the transplants were ahead of everything that would come up afterwards, and which was very minimal because the seed bank had been depleted. And if there's one thing separate from our soil health practices, which have also obviously been tremendous in a benefit, but keeping ahead of weeds so that we were never buried in weed management, particularly once you get into June and July when things are just popping. Not being buried by the weeds has allowed us to be a lot more flexible and grow a lot more diversity and grow at a higher density with fewer labor hours than I think anything else has provided.
Hey, you all, just going to jump in here real quick and get a word from our amazing sponsors like the Never Sink Farm course. Never Sink Farm grosses a striking $350,000 on 1.5 acres, and in his online courses, Farmer Connor Crickmore has put together one of the most comprehensive guides to how it's done and how you can too. I have seen inside of it. It is not gimmicky. There's a ton of information in there, including videos, but also PDFs and resource guides, and it is well laid out with contextual and practical considerations. For someone who has already been farming for 10 years, I'm talking about myself, I learned an embarrassingly large amount from my stroll around the Never Sink courses. There are over 60 hours of content ranging from indoor tomato and cucumber production to a whole section on flowers. There are great tutorials on irrigation, wells, infrastructure, hoop house design, but don't take my word for it. You can watch some of this content for free and get an idea of what's inside the course. Just go check it out over at neversinkcourses.com. This is a great investment in your education, and it will only continue to grow. Again, check that out, neversinkcourses.com. The show is also brought to you by Banner Greenhouses. Banner is a family-owned, certified organic vegetable and flower plant producer. This second-generation farm has been producing plant starts since 1991, and they are extremely good at it. My partner in no-tillgrowers.com, Jackson Roulette, has been using Banner transplants for years. I have some Banner transplants in my garden as I speak. We specifically sought them out as a sponsor because of how much we love their product and know you will too. Their greenhouses and outdoor growing area cover over 18 acres and enable them to provide optimum growing conditions for each cultivar. Get CCOF certified organic vegetable and flower transplants, which now include hemp, delivered straight to your farm, choosing a crop and desired plug size, then designating what week you want them to arrive. Whether you want to simplify your transplant production or don't yet have a prop house, get a better start with Banner Greenhouses. That's bannergreenhouses.com. All right, back to Hana and Daniel.
That's great. And can you kind of run us through a bed flip or two? In terms of, you talked about dense spacing. I think for things like beets and carrots, it's generally pretty easy. You pull them out and then you can put something back in. But what about maybe your lettuce or anything you're direct seeding that's not just being pulled completely out? Can you kind of run us through what a bed flip looks like?
Yeah. And this is, I'll have to say that this is one of those things that I continue to struggle with because I don't just run a tiller down it and have it be useful for a seeder again. It's a little bit more complex, and I frankly have not found the perfect solution. But for larger stuff, broccoli, cabbage, that sort of thing, we'll cut it off at the roots. We don't pull out the whole plant, but we'll come in with a machete or loppers and cut off right at ground level. And that works for removing the plant and keeping it from growing back. But it also creates the challenge of it creating little stumps that get snagged with the paper pot transplanter. And that's where the next layer of compost can provide a benefit. So we'll put down a layer of compost. If we have an early cabbage that comes out, we'll put down compost, and we'll be more or less seeding into the compost rather than seeding into the bed with the broccoli or cabbage stump underneath it. And so that's how we get around that. For stuff like you said, like with beets and carrots, we're largely removing the whole plant, so they're not an issue anymore. So we'll remove the plant, and then we'll do a quick rake. And then there's always a few weeds that escape the pre-management, so we'll go through and we'll hand weed as we're removing the last of the residue. So it's largely a bare bed again. So if it's carrots, we'll kind of rake the bed back into place, or we'll get out the tractor and actually shape it back into place, make sure all the weed residue and any remaining residues out, get it flat, and then we'll go back and seed whatever comes next. The most challenging one for coming onto it with a new crop has been lettuce mix. We grow about 200 pounds of lettuce mix a week for both our CSA and wholesale customers. which means we're flipping a bed every 3 weeks. We'll get 3 cuttings out of it, and then we need to like stop it. And so what we do now is I'll go through with a weed whacker and weed whack the entire surface and cut the lettuce down tight to the ground as best I can. And that usually kills, I would say, 75 to 80% of the lettuce stand. And then I rake all the residue back on top and put a tarp on it. And there's several beds adjacent to each other. I really work hard to have like 2 beds of arugula and 2 beds of lettuce and a bed of beets coming all out at the same time. So I have 5 or 6 beds all lined up, and I'll put a tarp across all of those when I transition all of them. And that tarp will break down the residue, kill any remaining lettuce heads, or excuse me, not lettuce heads, from the lettuce mix. And then I'll pull the tarp off after about 2 weeks. There's still residue left, but it's largely broken down. And then I'll rake any remaining residue into the aisle so that it's not in the way of the seeder or transplanter when we go through again. But having a little bit of residue on the soil surface when it's covered protects the soil surface from the extreme heat of the plastic, but also brings the soil biology right up to start eating and breaking down that residue. And so it creates this really nice tilthy texture right at the very surface. And if the temperature is just right, sometimes it's too hot, sometimes it's a little too cold, but when it's just right, we've lost all the residue. There's worms right up on top of the soil, and it can be really beautiful texture. And that's when it's ideal. The problems come when, like I say, the temperature's not quite right. It gets too hot underneath the tarp, and so stuff doesn't break down or too cold, same thing. And then we just have to rake more residue back. If it stays too cold, then not all of the lettuce mix will die off, and so then we'll end up having to come through after the tarp comes off and killing the last of it. And I'll probably use a wheel hoe. It's always on the corners of the beds. Yeah. So again, like the model we were intending is a high compost model of rotating, or between each rotation, we'd put down a layer of compost. And when we started, I was looking into, there's the Johnson-Su reactor. I know people are aware of these days. David Johnson-Su is a New Mexico professor on, I forget his title. Anyway, he works at the University of New Mexico, but he developed a particular kind of composter that was supposed to be no-turn. And I did that for a while, but it was very constrictive. Like it was a difficult size to manage. It didn't produce enough volume for all of the different uses we had for compost, and it was hard to get in it, build it, and it was hard to get it back out again. So then I switched to making it in windrows. And we have access, as a result of the lease that we have. We also lease a Bobcat. I should point that out very, very specifically. It's like, even in the first year, we probably made 10 yards of compost, and that was way more than I think I could ever do with a shovel. Now we have, like right now, we've got 120 yards of compost waiting for next year's production. And those sorts of volumes, it would be impossible to do by hand. 2 years ago, we were doing about 50 yards of compost, and again, it's essential to have a Bobcat. So after the David Johnson-Su method of using the caged reactors, we went to a more conventional windrow style, and we would source. We'd cut hay from the property that was real crappy wiregrass that we couldn't graze. We'd cut that and bale it. And we'd use that as one of the inputs. We'd get wood chips from a couple friends who were arborists and buy some from the nursery. And I'd collect compostables from a couple restaurants we delivered to. And then we'd incorporate a proportion of bedding from the goats and horses that we have at the farm as well. And I'd mix all those. It was about 50% wood chips and 40%, or 25% hay, and then another portion. The balance of that portion would be whatever we could gather, but particularly the bedding from the animals. with, manure and hay. And I'd mix that, and then I'd let it heat up, and I'd mix it again. I'd track temperatures, and it was very labor intensive. And I did the math for a presentation we did recently, and it cost me, if I paid myself $15 an hour, plus the inputs that I'd buy and all my time, it would cost me around $40 a yard to make that compost. That's including vehicle maintenance, and really trying to be honest with our expenses. And municipal compost in many larger municipalities costs less than that. And I'd be thrilled to buy pre-made compost that was of the quality I made or better. It's just not available in our area. So anyway, that's how we used to do it. Is the short of that. Now what we found is that there's a landfill. The county landfill collects not just the trash and recycling, but obviously in a separate pile, they collect all the fire mitigation wood and wood chips from the county and the city, and what county residents bring in. So they have this giant pile of trees and branches and brush and everything, and then they chip it up in a big barrel grinder once a year. And there's a pile up there. I don't even know how many thousands of yards. My 150 yards, or actually I collect about 300 yards a year. Now I don't even make an appreciable dent in it. There's so much more biomass available there than I could possibly use. But anyway, we use that because it sits in their windrow over winter and composts initially. I collect it in the spring, and I mix it with about 2% manure bedding, and then that lets it heat back up again, just to make sure I've killed all the weed seeds that it wasn't killed in the first windrow at the county. And then I'll let that sit, and ideally sit for most of the summer or even through the winter, and it develops this really good mycelial net. It just smells like beautiful earth after that. And it's largely all composted. There's some twigs and larger chunks in it, but it's beautiful stuff. And we'll use that. And because we can get it so cheaply, and because we can get so much volume, we can use it at a much larger volume. And that's just been a tremendous opportunity for us. Because we're using more volume now, we use about 1 yard per bed, and that's per 100-foot, 30-inch bed. I finally figured out that I can use a manure spreader. I take off the spreading paddles, the ones, or the flinging paddles that typically fling it farther out away from the spreader. I take that off, and then fill it up with the Bobcat and pull it across the bed with the tractor, and I can lay down 2 yards. And then additionally, we've converted all of our beds to 200-foot beds specifically for this manure spreader to be more efficient. We spread 2 yards of compost across 200 bed feet of the garden or of the bed all at once. I can do it alone rather than we used to do it by bucket, and it's allowed us to double the amount of yardage we put on any given bed.
I want to hear a little bit about the cover crops and the goats and how you manage that, and just a little bit about how that system works.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. So goats are, when you talk to people about goats, they often talk about how they're impossible to keep contained anywhere, that they're like master escape artists. And so when we started using goats for cover crops and for grazing cover crops, we were definitely a little nervous about how we were going to keep them contained, particularly because of, everything in the farm is built really compact and efficiently. So, we'll have a cover crop area, and then like 2 feet away, there's like lettuce mix, right? And we were pretty worried about the goats getting out and into the lettuce mix. What we found is that goats hate 2 things. They really don't seem to like electric fences at all. And they also don't like water at all. And so we string an electric fence. We do 3 levels of it. So when I'm putting it up, the first ones particularly if it's early in the spring and we have any kids that are still really small, it'll be, say, 3 to 4 inches off the ground so that they can't go under it. And then there's the second line of electric fences about 4 inches above that, and then about 4 inches above that, so that the highest it goes is on me is about hip height if I'm standing next to the fence. And those 3 lines prevent them from going under it or over it without hitting it. And all it really takes, the older goats are totally trained on it. They're pretty terrified of getting zapped, and so they don't go anywhere close to it. The younger ones, if they get zapped once or twice, that's all it usually takes for them to not push it. And so we, knock on wood, have never had goats escape out of those. And so we'll do that, if we're doing it on 1 or 2 blocks. What we tend to do is try to rotate them through a little bit. So if we have 2 blocks on cover crop, we'll put a fence up on 1 block first, or maybe even half of that block, and bring them in and let them graze it 1 to 2 days, and then move them to the next section so that they're hitting the section pretty hard and grazing most of it, and then moving on to the other one instead of being more selective. Goats do this really cool thing where they come in and they'll clip off this, if the flower, or if we've let the cover crop go a little too far and there's a seed head, they'll eat that first before the rest of the plant. And goats' digestive systems have the ability to actually break down seeds. And so if we do have any cover crop that has some seed on it, if they eat that seed, if they go for that seed pod first, they'll actually digest those seeds, so they're not just depositing them back down around the ground, and then we have weed seeds that we have to deal with later. So that makes them cool in that way. The water piece that I brought up is that the one exception to them not pushing the electric fence is if it starts to rain. We've noticed that they like just drizzling out of the air is enough to, at least our herd, which our Nubians, totally freaks them out. And so if it starts to rain and I'm on the other side of the field, I'll stop whatever I'm doing and sprint to get them out of there so that they don't push down the fence as they're trying to escape.
I was going to say it's worth noting that it's not ideal in all ways. Like there's the conventional, or not conventional, but there's the rotational grazing type of idea of how to manage animals on land, and we don't really do that in the same way because we're not managing perennial pasture. We're really trying to like recycle that cover crop back into the soil through the rumen of the animal, and but at the same time, like the hoofs on the beds, they kind of like beat things down a little bit, and we're very careful about stepping on the beds, but ultimately things are more compact when the goats have left than before they came. And so we're working ourselves on improving these methods. I think we'll continue to use goats on cover crops where they're on the farm for the entire season, where the cover crops are on the farm for the entire season. Then we'll bring goats in to graze it down. But we're also planning to start bringing in chickens that have less impact on the soil and also a higher amount of nitrogen that they can supply to the soil when they are grazing. So we'll bring in chickens and turkeys once the season's done, and have them graze down any remaining residue and eat seeds and that sort of thing. So the goats aren't perfect, and we're still looking to innovate more ways of incorporating animals that have more of the positive impacts and less of the negative impacts.
Yeah, and that's a good point that I didn't mention, which is that we are only grazing them on a section that is in cover crop for the entire season. And that's both because of how they can, compact the beds a little bit and stuff like that. It's also a food safety consideration. And so we're not like grazing down lettuce mix or cover crop or something like that, and then planting in another cash crop for that season in it. So one thing I want to add to our bed management is that in addition to, using the black plastic for weeds and the flame weeder, and then our compost, no-till, and transplanting most things, is that we do use in our rotation what we call a subsoiler. And that has been, essentially, Daniel can describe it in more detail, but it's an implement that he'll put on the back of the tractor and drive down the bed, and it'll go down about 12 to 18 inches below the surface and cut across the surface and just sort of lift the entire bed up slightly. And what we've found is that has allowed us, because of that super heavy clay that we started with, where 2 inches down it was just like adobe bricks, that minimal disturbance of the soil in that way and opening up a little bit of space has allowed for the biology to access that area a lot more rapidly than we think it would have in our scenario if we had just not done any of that. So that implement is kind of works in the same way that a broad fork would. In fact, we were using a broad fork when we were smaller, but after about a quarter to half acre, the broad fork just took way too much time. And so we use that one, and it's helped a lot. And, over the course of the 5 years we've been operating, all of those things we've been talking about, the no-till, the compost, the subsoiler, the cover crops, the grazing, all of those things, we've gotten our soil organic matter up to 7.15%. That was our 2018 soil test. And we started at, it's a little hard to know, the soil test that we did first, or that Daniel did back in 2016, showed 3.6%. It was likely lower than that. When Daniel did that soil test, we didn't entirely know how to do it correctly. So there was some sod and stuff that kind of was in there, which probably skewed that number slightly higher. So it was probably lower than that. But either way, we've seen that great improvement. And we've also gone, I don't know if we mentioned this before, across, it's not totally uniform, but across a lot of our 3 acres now, we have, I'd say, 10 to 12 inches of really good soil to work with, where we started with just that 1 to 2 and then hitting that clay pan. So that all of those things have really contributed to us being able to make that change in that about 4 year time period.
Yeah, just to reiterate a couple points there on the soil prep. So that the subsoiler that we're using is called a sweep plow. And we're not really using it as it was initially intended, but it works tremendously well in replacement for a broad fork. And like Hana said, we were able to broad fork each bed up till about a half an acre, and then it was just functionally impossible to do that broad fork work by hand anymore. And so when we started using the sweep plow to subsoil, I could then go from a 30-minute broad forking per bed to literally 2 minutes to drive down the length of the bed, and would lift the entire bed up. And when I was done, it looked exactly like I'd broad forked the whole thing. And what that really was about for us is that it aerated the soil at depth, so 12 inches or deeper, down where it was still anaerobic. I'd mentioned before that the clay was really anaerobic, even just 3 inches down when we started. And as I imagine the progression of improvement in soil health to be, it began with the sorghum Sudan grass really tillering down and really opening up the soil for the first time, which allowed me to then come back with this subsoiler, the sweep plow, and dig even deeper. And so the combination of both of those over 2 or 3 rotations in 2 years' time allowed us to really open up what had been anaerobic soil and create really nice aerobic soil that plants could actually grow in again. And then once we brought in the additional compost, we could begin to grow really rapidly and build up that soil organic matter quickly.
Well, Hana and Daniel, this has been absolutely excellent. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's fun.
All right, if you enjoyed this episode, and I know you did, check out Tierra Vida on Facebook or at their website. I will put all the links in the show notes over at no-tillgrowers.com. Also, check out no-tillgrowers.com. It is a great site. We try and put up as much no-till information as we can. We also are always looking for new info, new articles, new stories, new videos. So if you have any of that, feel free to shoot them to us at no-tillgrowers@gmail.com. That's our email, no-tillgrowers@gmail.com. There's a great forum over there, so go check that out. You can always engage with No-Till Growers there. Also, please consider signing up to be a patron at the Patreon page at patreon.com/farmerjesse, patreon.com/farmerjesse. We need to get that up to $1,000 a month to be able to afford a second season of this podcast. Admit it, you would miss the theme music. Anyway, you can also donate to No-Till Growers at Venmo. Venmo's like an app. It's for your phone. It's pretty useful. They don't pay me for that. But if they want to, that's super cool. Other than that, you all, thank you for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye. We talk about soil prep and we sell... Bah, bah, bah.